So,
If you've participated, even briefly, in the Azadari within the Indo-Pak community, you're probably no stranger to the role that the Punjabi language has played in the communication of Azadari. Now, I myself come from the East African Tanzanian diaspora, and I know a lot of people will contest that, especially the ones that know me. But I can tell you that even in the East African diaspora, while Urdu and Hindi, especially through the influence of, let's say, Rashid Turabi, had a very strong and has a very strong influence on the community, over the last 5 to 10 years, Punjabi has become a very, very influential language. Much like Urdu and Hindi, they may not quite understand it, but as a means of communication, as a means of delivering tone and voice when it comes to the narrative around Karbala, Punjabi has become a central force across a variety of diasporas that conduct the Azadari. My name is Ali Abbas Mahboob Hirji, and my daytime job, I work in AI and in cybersecurity, but I also do a little bit of research as part of my PhD at York University. And today, my guest, Sadia, before she introduces herself, is someone who comes from the Indo-Pak, specifically from an area that is central to the Punjab, Lahore. And in this discussion, she's going to be talking to us about how, after the partition of the Punjab and after the partition of British India into India and Pakistan, Lahore has become a central player in Azadari across the world, especially in the diaspora. So welcome to this discussion at the Hussain Global Conference. And I'm going to turn it over to Sadia for the next little while to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about the work that she does at York University. Sadia, welcome to this session. Please introduce yourself for our audience.
Thanks, Ali. My name is Sadia, and I am currently a PhD candidate in the humanities program at York University. My research is primarily focusing on the partition and partition narratives from the Indian subcontinent, and specifically focusing on women's narratives. And what brings me here today is to reflect on some of the Azadari traditions, as Ali pointed out, stemming from the predominantly Punjabi culture of Azadari that has taken root post-partition in Pakistan.
Very interesting. And, one of the things that, Sadia, during our undergrad years together, and we did study in our undergrads together, how you survived remains a mystery, but you survived your time studying with me and you went on to study graduate school. So good for you. We shall complete our PhDs as well. That's the goal. But Sadia, Lahore was always a fascinating concept for all of us, right? Myself, although not originally from Pakistan, Lahore was fascinating. Well, for food and its culture, also known as the Paris of the subcontinent at some period of time. But Lahore was very interesting to us because of books like Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, or when you read quotes from Mohsin Hamid, or when you read someone like a Yash Chopra saying something to the effect of, I've lived in Lahore before partition, and I can tell you, you can't separate Lahore from the Punjab or the Punjab from Lahore. Lahore is very, very central. Can you help our audience understand why you got interested in this field of study, or what we call post-colonial studies, and why is it such an important field when it comes to understanding the growth of Azadari, especially in the Indo-Pak? Sadia?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. I think for me, on a personal scale, being familiar with Punjabi, it's my first language, and also growing up as a part of the diaspora community outside of Pakistan, having that strong affinity to the city of Lahore has been part and parcel of who I am as a person. So finding that interest within academia, for example, for me was largely an issue of representation, not really seeing that get fleshed out in what we were studying. So all the scholarly works that you mentioned, or the literary works rather, I think we were fortunate enough to have access to these materials and to learn a bit more about what our respective cultural backgrounds would be. But seeing that, growing up surrounded by Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan's Qawwalis, for example, coming across live performances at Karbala Gamesha in Lahore. That was something that we weren't exactly seeing. So this really piqued my interest, and I wanted to study this further and see how much of it was waiting to be discovered. And that's what sort of took me back, and trying to find that tradition through this field of studies, and then tapping into the larger field of post-colonial studies helped to flesh that out further for me. And I think it's been a long journey since then, and not turning back per se.
I think that's a very important moment. You know, those references that you made, for example, to Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, or those references to Karbala Gamesha. These are central places within Lahore, and for that matter, Andruni Lahore, the internal areas of Lahore. These were all areas that were coming up in pop culture. If you remember, Sadia, when we did Multicultural Week at York, and the Pakistani Student Association, and many of their shows, etc., had Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. And then you had songs like the Madam Maskalandar. And then slowly but surely you had nights where Nohas like Katri Baba's Mera Ghar Jalaya, for example, the tunes of them started to become of interest to people. And I think this is a very important point for our audience, is that Lahore and Lahore's practices around Azadari was featuring in pop culture. Way before even you started seeing Azadari in Bollywood films, and we know a lot of references, controversial as well, references to different acts of Azadari. Lahore was coming up quite a bit. And I think, Sadia, when we studied post-colonial studies together, one of the most important things is that it gave us a language to start explaining to people what is Karbala Gamesha, what is this Markazi Julus that you're seeing, and that's coming on ARY News now, and that's taking over PTV, so on and so forth. So really important. I think you're right. It gave us a language to start talking academically about what you were seeing in Lahore. Now, Sadia, for our audience, can you help them understand, what did the partition do to Azadari rituals? In your perspective, what are some of those things that you noticed happen as a result of partition?
Well, before I answer that question, I think it might be useful to sort of give a brief background around what the partition is. So Britain extended imperial rule over the Indian subcontinent, which makes up present-day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. But British imperial rule lasted until 1947, and it created the independent states of India and Pakistan. So at that time, there was this movement of around 14 million people across the two newly created borders. So essentially dividing population predominantly based on the basis of religion. So this larger idea that the Muslims of the subcontinent would be moving to Pakistan, and predominantly Hindus and Sikhs would continue to stay on in India or move across to India. So I think that sort of understanding just stems from these politically charged narratives mostly. But what we need to bear in mind is that there was also a borrowing of traditions. And I think it's very important to demystify this sort of idea that Muslims did all sort of transferred over to Pakistan. That was not the case. And there was a very long established Shia tradition of mourning rituals established in Lucknow, for example. And that also led to a borrowing and an exchange across the borders as well. And what you mentioned previously about Lahore becoming this hub of cultural exchange and Shia mourning traditions, for example, that had a lot to do with the borrowing of the rituals that also transgress borders. So I think that that's very important to keep in mind. And a lot of that became subsumed into the mourning traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another after effect that you see of partition, specifically when it comes to talking about the Punjab, is, when I was recently in Iraq for Ashura, and I was traveling with an individual whose father happened to work at Aligarh University, he mentioned that in Ludhiana, for example, on the Indian side of Punjab, there actually was and still is a very small Imam Barga, which is very similar to the kind of stuff that you see in Karbala Gamisha, or whether you talk about Krishan Nagar in Lahore or Islampura or wherever else. So it's always interesting to see how these traditions move. Now, Sadia, it wouldn't be a session with me if I stayed entirely on script. I'm going to go a little bit off script and sort of put you to the task here. But Sadia, from your perception, why do you think now, especially 2020, and since, for example, Kaflas have been going to Sham, and then obviously Sham had its issues, and now you have Iraq and you have Iran, so on and so forth, you're seeing there's a lot of appetite for everybody wants to hear the Nohe from Lahore. They want to hear the Noah Khans from Lahore. They want to adopt some of their styles. Why do you think Lahore has become so important and central to all of this?
I think a part of that also has to do with something that you touched upon previously, by saying that at a time when we were looking into this, or we were studying this, that limited exposure, I feel that a lot of the diaspora community is waking up to this fact, or trying to engage with this idea of representation in some shape or form. But simultaneously, we are also seeing this synergy or this bond, because, as I mentioned, a lot of the content that surrounds the partition has always been so politically charged that the narratives become, pardon me for just making it so crude, but it's been done to death, right? So now the diaspora communities are finding more ways to bond, more ways and avenues to find commonality. And also that borrowing and exchange continues, because I feel that in more cases with the exposure, and a lot of that also has to do with the digital era that we find ourselves in as well. We can readily access Nohe, for example, through YouTube, and you might come across something that you might not linguistically be familiar with, but something that you can relate to because it is a feeling, right? So I think a lot of that is just coming together, and I think the diaspora community has a lot to do with that, and also that we find ourselves in this global era, right, where there's a merger happening, as you said, that there is that interest growing, and I think this is only the beginning of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if you go back to our university days as well, the influence of the Punjabi language, especially in Canada, has been very, very strong, right? And we saw a lot of influence of the Punjabi community in Brampton, specifically with the Sikh community. And we saw, and I mean, as you know, you've lived in Malton for a while. We've all spent time in Brampton, Etobicoke, except you've seen the Gurdwaras, except I think the Punjabi language was always a central force. I mean, there's been traditionals around Bhangra, so on and so forth. But once Punjabi started to become mainstream, even in the Shia community, and as a form of performance, people could relate to it quite a bit, because Punjabi was not something foreign to our communities here. And now with Punjabi Nohe coming out, Punjabi Qasidas, etc., it started to have an impact. But I also think it's interesting if you look at how Punjabi and Punjabi Nohes have influenced the UK Azadari rituals, and how that's now translating into Canada. You're now seeing Sangats forming. I mean, if you remember 2008, the only Punjabi style Sangat of Azadari that you would find was Markazi Matmi Sangat Toronto. And now you have 5 or 6 others, like we were talking about just yesterday. So it is quite interesting. Sally, let me ask you this. You referenced the digital era, right? And social media, so on and so forth. What about social media do you think people are forming connections now with Lahore as well through social media? What is it that you're seeing around Lahore Azadari and its connection to the diaspora online?
Just building on that point, I think social media has a lot to do with it as well in this digital era, because we have the liberty of almost transporting ourselves to another part of the world without physically being there, or getting some insight into what's happening on the ground. So being able to extract some of that and also implement that within the diaspora communities that are forming, again, these communities of their own, that seems to be happening a lot. And I just wanted to reflect on, again, that connectivity aspect of it. that once you have access to social media, someone posts a video of what's happening on the ground in Lahore, somebody who's not familiar with Punjabi will still get drawn in. I emphasize on the fact that Azadari is also a feeling, right? So that connectivity stems from being able to connect to the Punjabi language despite not having a familiarity with the language. So you see more of that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's certain things that are happening in Lahore now that are finding its way also now into the diaspora. For example, you look at the ways in which, from an Azadari standpoint, you look at, for example, now how in Toronto you can look at how the Zuljana comes out, right, and the way it's put together. You look at now, for example, how, for lack of a better word, I mean, I don't want to be crude about it, but just to be crude about it, the styles around Matam that have evolved as well. They're all now drawing a lot and heavily from Lahore. And I think one of the major things that's also coming out now from Lahore is this concept of teachers in Azadari. You have Ustad Akbar Abbas. You have Ustads who can teach you different areas of Noah Khani. You have Salars, for example, who teach you different styles or different ways in which to conduct Matam, etc. I think there's a form of mentorship that's also coming out of Lahore, which previously we didn't have access to. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think just to go back to your point, I think some of the I guess the more popular like Jalous routes during Muharram, they are taking root and shape in Lahore. They've been going on for decades, right? So the fact that, again, social media or media provides us access into those spaces and seeing that and wanting to replicate that, like you said, this emphasis on Zuljana, for example. So a lot of that becomes, again, a borrowing of a tradition, seeing it and, again, feeling affinity towards the Azadari rituals that are taking place and then implementing that in diaspora communities. And I think that that's fairly interesting.
Yeah, I know we've got about 3 minutes left, so I'll make a quick comment to you that somebody had shared with me on my flight to Iraq about when I was discussing this conference. And, he said that, and this was an elderly gentleman from Birmingham, and he said, one of the reasons he's seen that the Punjabi forms of Azadari have taken off quite a bit is because it's been a counter narrative to that sanitization of Azadari that's been happening quite a bit, right? Or do we need to be mourning in this way? Do we need to be conducting our rituals in a certain way? And Lahore sort of brings things to you raw, unabashed, and sort of in your face. And I think this point that you made earlier on about bonds that have been created, when I was in Iraq, for example, now you see groups from the UK are bringing, for example, groups from Lahore, like Ravi Road comes in, brought in by the folks from UK. Khatri comes in, spends time with the Canadian folks, so on and so forth. This relationship that's been created, which I think is very, very strong, but also significant of the fact that Lahore has a lot to teach when it comes to Azadari. Sadia, final question for you. I know this is a very vast topic, but if you had to summarize it, if somebody really wants to study Azadari from a partition perspective in the diaspora, so on and so forth, how do they get started? You had the advantage of being in university and being in these programs. Anybody wants to study this for their own, where do they get started from?
So good question. I'm just going to take a quick point back to covering the charm of Androon Lahore, which I think everybody kind of is seeing and wanting to mirror as well, which I personally, obviously, given my background, I think is excellent. But to answer your question, I think we were fortunate enough to have that access, but I do find that, my limited exposure to certain research or literary works delved into a broader interest in academia, which is what made me continue on. But I do want to point out that research is available. There is excellent research on Shia Islam in colonial India, for example, that gives us insight into all the material that is there waiting to be consumed, right? This is there for the taking. But I think because we try to pigeonhole ourselves sometimes into certain fields, we all have busy lives, we're in a different field altogether, we might not come around to studying this. I've had the pleasure of teaching, for example, Shahid Ali's poetry on Muharram in Srinagar, for example, but I know that not everybody will have that access. So I think the onus is on us to kind of go out there and search for these scholarly works and broaden our understanding. And, on a personal scale, I will say that perhaps this is the best way to limit, again, the negative and the politically charged narratives, and try to focus instead on what unites us, or what types of bonds we can formulate, that sort of synergy that you talk about. And on a final note, just we were discussing this the other day about Urdu communities, or the Khoja community as well, just, delving into that Punjabi Nohe, for example. So that exchange that keeps on happening. And we know that Punjabi, established Punjabi Azadari rituals, or Nohes, for example, were not always the case, right? There was that borrowing that I also mentioned earlier. So that exchange happens, and it brings mourners together, right? And I think that is what we should sort of be emphasizing on. And again, there is research that is readily available. And I would strongly encourage anyone who is interested in this field to see how it's shaped over time.
Absolutely. And I think, access to you, Sadia, is also a very good starting point for all those that are watching. We have come to the last 10 seconds, but I will say this: Sadia's contacts are available on the Hussain Global website, or you could follow them on Instagram and you can get her details and reach out to her if you are interested at all in beginning your scholarly pursuits in this field. As she mentioned, Agha Shahid Ali is one good example. Renan Shabel's work is another good example. Avi Astor, who's speaking at this conference as well, another good example of people that are studying Azadari in Lahore and that have much to offer. Some time ago, Sadia had said that, I shared this on an Instagram post, right? They say, right, that if you haven't seen Lahore, you haven't been born. And I think that's because of the feelings, right? The feelings that comes out of Lahore. Lahore is not a place, it's a feeling. And even though you may not understand the language, even though you may not understand some of the traditions, you feel that Azadari. I invite everybody to look at some videos put out by Irza Khan, a well-known journalist in Pakistan, where she covers Azadari in Andruni Lahore, especially at the Havelis and the concept of Nisar Haveli, etc. All very beautiful, and just a feeling that you can relate to in some shape or fashion. I've always believed beyond those poles of right and wrong is a place. That place is Lahore, where Azadari happens on the basis of a feeling. So thank you, Sadia, for bringing Lahore to life again for us. I really appreciate you taking the time. To our audience, if you want to reach out, contact details have been shared. And I look forward to listening to other sessions and also connecting with all of you on the subject of how Lahore continues to advance the Azadari, not just in the Indo-Pak, but beyond into the diaspora. Thank you for joining, and Sadia, thank you as well for your time. You take care.
Thank you for having me.